Okay, so what I want to talk about is another aspect of that distinguishes presidential from parliamentary systems of government, and that has to do with the division of power. And this is basically talking about, in a way, political power, although that's simplifying it a little bit too much. But anyway, we measure power along two different lines. The first one is in terms of geographic division of power, and that refers to how power is or is not divided across geographic spaces. In other words, we're looking at the federal government or the national government and what are called subnational units. Here in the United States, we call those our states. Other countries call them departments, provinces, territories. They have different names in different countries. But the idea is that to determine how much division of power there is or is not, you can look at how shared that power is between the national government and these subnational units. Another way of thinking of the division of power, another dimension of it, is institutional. And that one is very simply, how much is power either divided or concentrated in a single institution of government. And here we're talking specifically about the three branches of government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. So you can have countries that have a greater distribution of power with regard to these three branches of government, and that's kind of what we see in the United States with the separation of power, with the checks and balances. What we're talking about there is a division of power across institutions. Okay, so we can think about two different ways of dividing power. One is geographic, the division between the national government and subnational units, or the extent to which power is divided across those two entities or two categories, and then institutional, the division between the branches of government. When we think about the geographic distribution of power, political scientists have created a couple of categories that demonstrate this division of power geographically. And here we're talking about a federal system of government versus a unitary system of government. A federal system of government is what Americans are used to here in the United States. It basically means, as you already know, or most of you know, that there's a division of power between the national government and the states and the subnational units. The power is fragmented, basically, geographically between the national government and the states. In a unitary system, on the other hand, you have a situation where basically all power is concentrated in the national government. Okay. Now here we don't make unitary governments, for the most part, don't make a distinction between, institutions. Okay. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we compare parliamentary versus presidential. But unitary system, basically, it was referring to geographic distribution of power, where power is residing in the national government at the national level. And subnational units basically don't have any power along a variety of different dimensions. The global map that you see there actually shows countries that are federal systems. Those are the countries that are in green. So you obviously have the United States, you have Canada, you have Russia, Argentina, Brazil, India. But most countries actually have some form of unitary government where power actually is concentrated at the national level. But you can here we have a visual depiction of federalism versus unitary government throughout the globe, and you can see how it varies from region to region and size. I mean, a lot of the countries that are larger tend to have federal systems of government, exception being China, for example. Okay, so let's take a look at the difference between presidential and parliamentary. So when we look at the difference between these two, and I'm going to simplify here for the time being, what we see in presidential systems, again, kind of across the board, the pattern is that presidential systems or democratic presidential systems exhibit a deeply divided or deeply fragmented distribution of power, both geographically and institutionally. In other words, in most presidential systems, you will find that power is divided, is shared between the national government and states or subnational units. But also in the presidential system of government, as we were talking about last week, you see a division of power, fragmentation of power across institutions. In other words, you have the executive branch, which is chosen independently from the judiciary or from the legislature, and the judiciary is also independent of those two other institutions. So power is divided institutionally as well. So in a presidential system, a typical presidential system, you have this deep fragmentation of power, both geographically and institutionally, on average, most of the time, or on one end. But parliamentary systems, we see the opposite. So in parliamentary systems, we actually see a deep concentration of power, both geographically and institutionally. And so here in parliamentary systems, basically what we're talking about are systems that are called unitary. And this is primarily because of the principle of parliamentary supremacy. In a parliamentary system, as you saw last week, it is the only institution where there is a direct election for those members, and it's from the parliament that they form the government. That relationship is also true in connection to the judicial branch. In other words, the judicial branch in a pure parliamentary model does not perform the function of judicial review. In other words, it cannot rule on the constitutionality of laws passed by the parliament. The parliament is supreme. So you cannot have an institution like the judicial branch that can come in and actually say this law is unconstitutional. So there's no, again, in the ideal type parliamentary system, there is no constitutional review court that actually does that. So it's the concentration of power is institutional, and that concentration of power happens in the parliament. So you see that aspect of it being concentrated in the parliament compared to the other two institutions, but also parliamentary systems in their ideal form, if you will, are also unitary systems in the sense that all power is geographically concentrated at the national level. That subnational units basically exist at the whim of the federal government, of the national government. So, for example, the United Kingdom historically has been a very unitary system where power is concentrated in London and concentrated in the House of Commons. Only recently has the United Kingdom actually devolved power, has changed from the situation where now specific regions have parliaments. For example, Scotland now has a parliament, as well as Wales has a parliament. London, prior to roughly, I think, 15 years ago, I believe, the mayor of London was actually nominated, was appointed by the federal government. About 20 years ago, that was changed, and so now people who live in London can actually choose directly in a popular vote, in a democratic vote, who their mayor is. So we can see how also countries that are parliamentary, that have this concentration of power, can also change over time for a variety of reasons. So again, just to recap, there's a tendency of presidential systems to be deeply fragmented politically in terms of power, both geographically and institutionally. The parliamentary system tends to be where concentration is power is concentrated both geographically at the national level as well as institutionally at the parliamentary level, in the parliament. Okay. Now, not so fast. So as we've seen throughout this semester, oftentimes it's not an either or, even though we often categorize countries as one thing or another. We label them. Most of the time there are gradations, there are variations, and the concentration of power, distribution of power is no different. So Freedom House, for example, you can calculate the degree of democraticness of countries along a scale of 1 to 7 or 0 to 100, which is what they're doing now. You can do the same thing with distribution of power. So instead of talking about the distribution of power as a dichotomous variable, in other words, you either have it concentrated or you have it distributed or not concentrated, you can think of this along a spectrum of deep fragmentation of power versus a very strong concentration of power. So, for example, scholars have created what is called a regional authority index, and I think my video is partially obscuring a little bit of this. But you can see here the bottom axis, is the index. Similar to the democracy index of Freedom House, you have a -2 to a +2. So on the right-hand side, you have countries that are deeply fragmented politically, and in this case, they're really talking about regional power. How much regional power is there in the country? Versus, on the other hand, you have a concentration of power at the national level, geographically at the national level. And so you can see here, this is a spectrum. So on the right-hand side, you can see that countries like Germany, Belgium, the United States are deeply fragmented geographically, whereas on the other side, you have Luxembourg, Portugal, Ireland, New Zealand, UK is there, and then countries somewhere in the middle, such as Netherlands, France, and Italy. Okay, so you see this variation across countries in terms of the degree to which there is geographic, this is referring to geographic distribution of power.